His hand slid down to block her path. She couldn't move. Her shoulders hunched inward, chin dropping as she calculated how to survive the next 60 seconds without making it worse. The bar fell quiet. Ice cubes stopped clinking. Conversations died mid-sentence. But the man cornering her had no idea he just made a fatal mistake. Because watching from the corner booth, perfectly still in his tailored black suit, sat the one person in Los Angeles you never, ever disrespected. And what happened next would erase this man from the city entirely. Stay until the end, because this story will leave you speechless. Before we start, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Now let's dive in. It's a warm Friday night in West Hollywood, present day. The Azure Lounge glowed with amber light and the low hum of Korean jazz. Well-dressed professionals nursed craft cocktails while conducting deals over hushed voices and encrypted phones. This wasn't just any lounge. This was Kang Tae-won's kingdom. Every server understood the rules without being told. Every patron knew the code. You kept your head down. You showed respect. And you never, ever crossed the invisible lines that kept this place civilized. Kang Tae-won sat in booth 7 like a king on a throne he never asked for. His back was to the wall. His eyes swept the room in slow, methodical patterns. Nothing escaped his notice. Not the nervous businessman in the corner checking his watch every 30 seconds. Not the couple pretending their marriage wasn't falling apart over imported wine. Not the waitress with the ponytail who moved through the crowd like a ghost. He'd been coming to the Azure Lounge for 3 years. Always the same booth. Always the same drink, whiskey, no ice, expensive enough that most men couldn't pronounce it. The staff knew better than to ask if he wanted anything else. They brought the bottle. They poured once. Then they disappeared. The lounge operated on rules that were never written down but everyone understood. Rule 1, mind your business. The man 2 tables over might be laundering money through his restaurant chain. The woman at the bar might be meeting her divorce lawyer to plan her husband's financial ruin. It didn't matter. You looked straight ahead. You kept your voice low. You finished your drink and left. Rule 2, respect the hierarchy. Tae-won wasn't the owner. He didn't need to be. His presence alone changed the temperature of the room. When he walked in, conversations paused. When he lifted his glass, the bartender noticed. When his phone buzzed, people 3 tables away felt the shift in energy. Rule 3, never cause a scene. The Azure Lounge survived because powerful people needed a place where they could breathe without cameras or questions. Blood didn't spill here. Voices didn't rise. Problems were handled quietly somewhere else, by people who knew how to make things vanish. Tae-won had built his reputation on silence. Other men in his line of work loved to talk. They made threats. They pounded tables. They wanted everyone to know their name. Tae-won believed the opposite. The less you said, the more people feared what you might do. He'd learned that lesson young, back when survival meant reading a room faster than the man next to you. His tattoos told stories he never spoke out loud. The dragon wrapped around his collarbone represented protection. The characters running down his shoulder spelled out a promise he'd made to a dead man. Most people saw the ink and assumed violence. They weren't wrong. But they weren't completely right either. Tonight he wasn't here for business. He was here because Friday nights at the Azure Lounge were predictable, and predictability was the closest thing to peace a man like him could find. He opened his leather ledger, reviewing numbers that had nothing to do with crime and everything to do with keeping his world balanced. Then he saw it. Across the room. The waitress with the ponytail. And the man who didn't understand Rule 3. Clara Seo had perfected the art of being invisible by the time she turned 22. She kept her head down. She smiled just enough to seem polite but not enough to invite conversation. She moved through the Azure Lounge like water finding the path of least resistance. Efficient. Forgettable. Safe. Most people thought she was naturally shy. They were wrong. Shyness was something you were born with. Invisibility was something you learned when the world taught you that being noticed only brought trouble. She'd been working at the lounge for 8 months. The pay was good. The tips were better. And most importantly, the customers left her alone. Men in expensive suits didn't waste time flirting with waitresses who looked like they might cry if you said hello too loudly. Clara had learned to weaponize that perception. Small shoulders. Quiet voice. Eyes that never quite met yours. What none of them knew was why she was really here. Why Kang Tae-won had personally called the manager and told him to hire her. Why she never paid rent on her apartment 3 blocks away. Why certain men who'd made the mistake of following her home had disappeared from the city within 48 hours. It all came back to a rainy night in Seoul 15 years ago. Clara barely remembered it. She'd been 7 years old, hiding behind her father's legs while men with guns argued in Korean she didn't understand. Her father, David Seo, had been a translator for international business deals. The kind that happened in warehouses instead of boardrooms. That night, he'd stumbled onto something he wasn't supposed to see. A young enforcer named Kang Tae-won, barely 19, bleeding out from a knife wound while his own crew debated whether saving him was worth the risk. David Seo had made a choice. He'd driven Tae-won to a doctor who didn't ask questions. He'd paid with money he didn't have. He'd kept his mouth shut when the police came asking about the blood in his car. Tae-won never forgot. When David Seo died of a heart attack 6 years later, he'd left behind a daughter, a mountain of medical debt, and a single phone number written on the back of a business card. Clara had been too proud to call it. She'd worked 3 jobs. She'd survived on instant noodles and willpower. She told herself she didn't need help from a criminal. Then a man had cornered her outside her apartment. And the next morning, that man was gone. And Clara's debt had vanished from every hospital record. And a woman in a black suit had handed her an address to the Azure Lounge with the simple message: "You're protected now. Don't refuse it." So Clara had learned to disappear. To serve drinks and collect tips and pretend she didn't notice the man in booth 7 who watched over her like a debt he'd never stopped paying. Daniel Mercer had been drinking for 3 hours, and confidence had long since crossed into entitlement. He was a regular at the Azure Lounge. A venture capitalist who'd made his money buying struggling companies and selling them for parts. He wore expensive watches and talked loudly about deals that made other men feel small. Tonight he decided Clara was part of the scenery he'd paid to enjoy. It started with comments. Small things that technically weren't crimes but made her skin crawl. "Smile more, sweetheart. Tips are better when you look happy." She'd forced a smile. Kept moving. Delivered his whiskey sour and escaped before he could say anything else. But Daniel was bored. And bored men with too much money rarely knew when to stop. The second time she came to his table, his hand brushed her wrist when she set down his drink. Not an accident. A test. She pulled away quickly, professionally, like she hadn't noticed. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The lounge was full. People were watching. Surely someone would say something. No one did. Daniel leaned back in his chair, satisfied. He'd found tonight's entertainment. By the 3rd round, he'd moved to the bar. Positioned himself right where she had to pass to reach the other tables. Clara felt the shift immediately. The space that had felt open now felt like a trap. She tried to go around him. He shifted. Blocked her path. Smiled like they were old friends. "You know, you're the prettiest girl here," he said, his voice low enough that the bartender pretended not to hear. "Why do you always look so sad?" Clara kept her eyes down. "Excuse me, sir. I need to get through. I'm talking to you." His hand landed on the bar beside her, cutting off her escape route. "It's rude to ignore someone who's giving you a compliment." Her throat tightened. This was the moment. The moment where she could make a scene. Call for the manager. Demand respect. But Clara had learned long ago that making scenes only made things worse. Men like Daniel didn't get embarrassed. They got angry. And angry men found ways to make you pay later. So she did what she always did. She made herself smaller. "I'm sorry." "Thank you. I really need to." His other hand moved. Slow. Deliberate. It landed on her waist, fingers pressing just hard enough to claim ownership. Clara froze. Her entire body went rigid. This wasn't a comment anymore. This wasn't a test. See? That wasn't so hard, Daniel whispered, his breath hot against her ear. You just needed to relax. Across the room, in booth 7, a leather ledger closed with a sound like a judge's gavel. Kang Tae-won had seen enough. Tae-won didn't move. Not yet. Movement would draw attention, and attention would give Daniel Mercer a chance to stop. To apologize. To walk away before the sentence became final. Tae-won didn't want him to walk away. His eyes tracked every detail. The way Clara's shoulders had drawn up toward her ears. The defensive angle of her arm pressed against her body. The small step backward she tried to take before Daniel's grip tightened on her waist. Most people wouldn't notice these things. Tae-won had built his life on noticing what others missed. He'd been watching Clara since her first shift 8 months ago. Not because he wanted anything from her. Because he owed her father everything. David Seo had saved his life when he was 19 and bleeding out in a warehouse. The old man had asked for nothing in return. Had never called in the favor. Had died believing that one good deed didn't require repayment. But Tae-won lived by a different code. Debts weren't suggestions. They were architecture. The framework that kept his world from collapsing into chaos. He promised himself that David Seo's daughter would never feel unsafe again. Would never have to beg for protection. Would never stand alone against men who believed their money made them bulletproof. Daniel Mercer was about to learn how wrong that belief could be. Tae-won set his glass down. The sound was soft, barely audible over the jazz piano, but the two men seated near him caught it. They'd worked for Tae-won long enough to recognize the shift. One of them, a quiet man named Jean, leaned forward slightly. Waiting for instructions. Tae-won shook his head once. Not yet. He watched Daniel's lips move near Clara's ear. Watched her body language scream what her voice wouldn't say. Watched the bartender look away like he'd suddenly gone blind. In any other establishment, someone would intervene. A manager. Security. Another customer with a functioning conscience. But this was the Azure Lounge, where people minded their business and pretended not to see. Where powerful men made their own rules and expected the world to bend around them. Daniel Mercer had forgotten something crucial. He wasn't the most powerful man in this room. He wasn't even close. Tae-won picked up his phone. Typed a message with two hands that had never trembled, not even when they'd done terrible things. The message was simple. 3 words to his lieutenant stationed outside. Bring the car. Then he stood. Slowly. Deliberately. His height and the cut of his suit drew eyes immediately. The intricate tattoos visible above his collar made those eyes drop just as fast. He buttoned his jacket. Smoothed the fabric. Gave Daniel Mercer exactly 5 more seconds to realize his mistake. Daniel didn't notice. He was too busy whispering promises Clara would never want fulfilled. Those 5 seconds expired. Tae-won began walking toward the bar. Daniel Mercer woke up Saturday morning with a headache and no memory of how he'd gotten home. The last thing he remembered clearly was the lounge. The pretty waitress. The way she'd finally stopped resisting and just accepted his attention like a smart girl should. He smiled at the memory while making coffee. Some women just needed a firm hand. A reminder that confidence was attractive. By Monday, she'd probably be flattered. Might even slip him her number. His phone buzzed. A text from his assistant. Someone's waiting in your office. Says it's urgent. Daniel frowned. It was Saturday. The building should be empty. He texted back. Clue. Didn't give a name. Just said you want to hear what he has to say. 20 minutes later, Daniel walked into his corner office on the 14th floor. A man sat in the guest chair like he owned it. Mid-30s. Athletic build. Dark suit that probably cost more than Daniel's car payment. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were the coldest thing Daniel had ever seen. Who the hell are you? Daniel demanded. And how did you get past security? The man didn't stand. Didn't offer a handshake. He simply reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope. Set it on the desk between them. My name is Gene Park. I work for someone who was at the Azure Lounge last night. His voice was calm. Professional. Like he was discussing a business merger instead of a threat. He asked me to deliver this personally. Daniel's confidence flickered. Something about the way this man sat, completely unafraid, completely certain, made his stomach tighten. I don't know what you're talking about. I go to the lounge all the time. I didn't do anything wrong. Open the envelope. Get out of my office before I call the cops. Jin's expression didn't change. The envelope contains photographs from last night. Security camera footage. Timestamps. Witness statements. Everything you did to Clara Seo, documented in detail. He paused. Open it. Or don't. Either way, you need to understand something. Daniel's hand moved toward the envelope despite himself. He pulled out the contents. His face went pale. The photographs were crystal clear. His hand on her waist. His lips near her ear. The look on her face that any jury would recognize as fear. There were bank statements too. His bank statements. Transactions he'd buried under shell companies. Deals that would interest the SEC if anyone looked close enough. What is this? Daniel's voice cracked. Gene stood. Buttoned his jacket. This is your only warning. You have 48 hours to leave Los Angeles. Sell your condo. Quit your job. Disappear. If you're still here Monday morning, these documents go to every news outlet, every regulatory agency, and every investor you've ever screwed over. You can't. We already have. Gene walked toward the door, then paused. One more thing. Clara Seo is protected. If you ever speak her name again, you won't get another warning. The door closed with a quiet click. Daniel sat alone in his office, holding evidence of his own destruction, and finally understood what real power looked like. Taewon stood by his apartment window, watching the city lights blur into constellations of amber and white. Gene had texted 20 minutes ago. The message was simple. Delivered. He looked scared. Good. Fear was a language men like Daniel Mercer understood better than reason. But tonight, Taewon wasn't thinking about Daniel. He was thinking about a girl he hadn't saved. A girl whose name still appeared in his dreams 15 years later, always just out of reach, always asking why he'd been too late. Her name was Minji. She'd been 17. Taewon had been 23, already knee-deep in a world that traded in violence and silence. Minji had worked at a convenience store near his apartment in Seoul. She'd always smiled when he came in. Always asked how his day was, even though she probably knew exactly what kind of work paid for his expensive clothes. He'd warned her once. Told her to quit. The neighborhood was getting dangerous. The wrong people were circling. She'd laughed and said she needed the money for college. Said she could handle herself. Taewon had believed her. That was his first mistake. The second mistake was assuming the men who ran the protection racket in that district had the same code he did. They didn't. When Minji's boss refused to pay, they decided to send a message. They'd waited until her closing shift. Until she was alone, counting the register, humming a song Taewon would never be able to forget. By the time he'd gotten the call, it was already over. The store was dark. The register was empty. And Minji was gone, taken to a place Taewon would spend 3 days tracking down. 3 days too long. He'd found her in a warehouse basement. Alive, but barely. The fear in her eyes had burned itself into his memory like a brand. She'd looked at him, this man she'd smiled at, this man who'd promised the neighborhood was safe, and asked a question he couldn't answer. Why didn't you stop them? Taewon had dismantled the entire operation within a week. The men responsible had disappeared so thoroughly that even their families stopped asking questions. But it didn't matter. Minji had left Korea. Left her college dreams behind. Last he'd heard, she was living in Canada under a different name, trying to forget a trauma that should never have happened. That's when Taewon had made his promise. Never again. No woman under his watch would ever feel that kind of fear. No girl would ever have to ask why he'd been too late. David Seo had saved Taewon's life in a warehouse. Now Taewon protected David's daughter with the same ferocity. Not because he wanted gratitude. Not because he expected anything in return. Because 15 years ago, he'd failed someone who'd smiled at him and believed the world was safer than it was. Clara would never know Minji's name. Would never understand why Taewon's protection felt personal instead of transactional. But she'd never have to ask why he hadn't stopped them. Because this time, he had. Daniel Mercer didn't leave Los Angeles. He'd spent Saturday night convincing himself the threat was empty. Some thug playing dress-up. Some wannabe gangster who thought he could scare a man with real connections. By Sunday afternoon, Daniel had decided to call the bluff. Monday morning, his phone rang. Unknown number. Mr. Mercer? The voice was smooth, professional. Female. This is Caroline from the Azure Lounge. Mr. Hayworth would like to extend a private invitation for tonight. 8 o'clock. VIP room 3. Daniel's heart rate picked up. Marcus Hayworth owned half the commercial real estate in downtown LA. Getting a private meeting with him was like getting an audience with royalty. This was it. The big break he'd been positioning himself for. What's the occasion? Daniel tried to sound casual. Mr. Hayworth is assembling a new investment group. Your name came up. He'd like to discuss opportunities. She paused. The invitation is time-sensitive. Will you be attending? Daniel's fear from Saturday evaporated. See? This was how the real world worked. You showed strength. You didn't run from threats. And opportunities found you. Tell Mr. Hayworth I'll be there. At 7:55, Daniel walked into the Azure Lounge wearing his best suit and his most expensive watch. The hostess smiled and led him past the main floor, down a hallway he'd never noticed before. The VIP rooms were legendary. Soundproofed. Private. Where the real deals happened. She opened the door to room 3. Mr. Hayworth will be with you shortly. Please make yourself comfortable. The room was elegant. Leather chairs. A table with crystal decanters. Soft lighting that made everything look like a movie scene. Daniel poured himself a drink and sat down, already planning his pitch. The door opened 5 minutes later. But it wasn't Marcus Hayworth who walked in. Kang Taewon entered the room like a shadow gaining weight. He wore the same tailored black suit from Friday night. The same cold expression. The tattoos on his neck seemed darker in the dim light, like warnings written in a language Daniel was just beginning to understand. Daniel stood so fast his chair scraped backward. What is this? Where's Hayworth? There is no Hayworth. Taewon closed the door behind him. The lock clicked with a sound like a cell door shutting. There's only you and me. And a conversation you should have taken seriously on Saturday. Daniel's hand moved toward his phone. Taewon didn't stop him. Didn't move at all. Just watched with those terrible, patient eyes. No signal, Taewon said quietly. Soundproofed walls. No cameras. No witnesses. Just like you prefer. The room suddenly felt smaller. The elegant furniture looked like props in a stage play Daniel didn't want to be part of. He thought about running. About screaming. About all the choices that had led him to this moment. Taewon sat down in the chair across from where Daniel had been sitting. Gestured to the empty seat. Sit down, Mr. Mercer. We need to discuss what happens when men like you don't listen to warnings. Daniel's legs stopped working. He sat. Taewon didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. The room did the work for him. Soundproofed. Locked. A space where consequences couldn't be outrun. You were given 48 hours, Taewon said, his tone almost conversational. You chose to ignore that gift. So now we discuss the alternative. Daniel's mouth felt like sandpaper. Look, I don't know what you think I did, but... Friday night. 9:47 p.m. You put your hand on Clara Seo's waist without permission. You trapped her against the bar. You whispered in her ear while she tried to disappear. Taewon leaned back, completely relaxed. You made her feel the way prey feels when it realizes there's no escape. I was just being friendly. She's being dramatic. Stop. The single word cut through the room like a blade. I'm not interested in your justifications. Men like you always have them. Always have reasons why the rules don't apply. Why she should be flattered. Why you were just having fun. Taewon pulled out his phone. Tapped the screen. Turned it toward Daniel. The video played in perfect clarity. Daniel's hands sliding around Clara's waist. Her body going rigid. The look on her face that no lawyer could spin as consent. The timestamp in the corner proved every second. This video currently exists in 3 locations, Taewon said. My phone. A lawyer's office. And a server that will automatically send it to the LAPD, the Los Angeles Times, and your company's board of directors if I don't cancel the timer every 24 hours. Daniel felt his world tilting. What do you want? Money? I can pay. Your condo in Santa Monica is worth $1.2 million. You'll sell it by Friday. The proceeds go to a charity that supports service workers who've experienced harassment. Taewon's voice never changed. Calm. Methodical. Your investment portfolio is worth approximately $4 million. You'll liquidate half. Same charity. That's insane. I'll be ruined. Your car lease will be terminated. Your country club membership will be cancelled. You have professional contacts in 6 states. You'll sever all of them. Taewon stood, smoothing his suit. By next Monday, you will be on a plane to Miami. You'll take a position at your cousin's insurance firm. $60,000 a year. No executive title. No power lunches. No opportunities to put your hands on women who can't fight back. Daniel's hands shook. You can't force me to do this. You're right. I can't. Taewon walked toward the door, then paused. But if you're still in Los Angeles next Tuesday, that video goes live. Your assets get frozen by federal investigators who'll suddenly be very interested in your offshore accounts. And Clara Seo gets to watch the news report about your arrest from the safety of the lounge you'll never enter again. Taewon opened the door. Light from the hallway spilled in. You have a choice, Mr. Mercer. Disappear with some dignity. Or be erased with none. He left Daniel sitting alone in the VIP room, surrounded by expensive furniture, and the ruins of a life built on believing consequences were for other people. 3 weeks later, the Azure Lounge looked exactly the same. Same amber lighting. Same jazz piano humming through the speakers. Same well-dressed professionals conducting business over expensive drinks. But something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface. Clara noticed it first. The way men's eyes slid past her now instead of lingering. The way conversations paused when she approached a table, then resumed without anyone trying to pull her into them. The bartender had started asking if she needed breaks. The manager had quietly updated the staff handbook with a section on harassment that actually meant something. Word had spread the way it always did in places where powerful people gathered. Daniel Mercer had vanished. Sold everything. Left town so fast he'd abandoned a closet full of custom suits. Nobody knew exactly why, but everyone knew it had something to do with the quiet man in booth 7. The unspoken rules of the Azure Lounge had been rewritten. And the new first rule was simple: respect the staff, or answer to calm Taewon. Clara moved through her Friday shift differently now. Her shoulders didn't hunch quite so far inward. Her ponytail swung a little higher. She still kept her voice soft, still avoided unnecessary attention, but it wasn't armor anymore. It was just preference. At 10 p.m., she approached booth 7 with Taewon's usual whiskey. He was reviewing his ledger, same as always. But when she set the glass down, something unexpected happened. She didn't immediately walk away. Thank you, Clara said quietly. Her eyes met his for the first time in 8 months. I know what you did. Taewon looked up. For a moment, The cold calculation in his expression softened into something almost human. Your father saved my life once. This is just returning the favor. My father would have liked knowing his kindness mattered. Clara's voice was steady. I think he'd be proud of what you've become. Taewon doubted that. David Seo had been a good man who'd made one dangerous choice. Taewon had built an empire on dangerous choices. But hearing those words, that someone like David Seo might have seen value in the monster his mercy had created, touched something Taewon had thought was dead. How's the shift tonight? He asked. Peaceful. Clara allowed herself a small smile. Boring, actually. In the best way. She turned to leave, then paused. The whiskey's on me tonight. Consider it a thank you from someone who finally feels safe at work. Taewon watched her walk away, her posture straighter than he'd ever seen it. Around the lounge, other servers moved with the same quiet confidence. The predators had learned to hunt elsewhere. The space had become what it should have been all along, neutral ground where people did business without becoming casualties. He closed his ledger and lifted his glass. The whiskey tasted the same as always. But for the first time in 15 years, Taewon didn't see Minji's face when he drank it. He saw Clara, standing tall, finally free. And he felt something he'd almost forgotten existed, peace.